Yo, what's poppin', Low Gang? Today we're going to be doing another Patreon rant. This one comes from Minnie, who says, I'm forcing you to read my story. Review the 2 chapters that are out. I'm slowly working on the 3rd, don't worry. Now, the reason why he's telling me to review the first 2 chapters as opposed to just 1 chapter of it, first of all, because the first 2 are the only ones that are currently out. But secondly, I've actually I had read the first chapter before he told me to do this. I had just done it of my own accord because he's in my my patron-only Discord server, and I consider him a friend. Now, before we get into the rant proper, funny story, actually, right? So, I tried to do this rant last night. That's right, it was supposed to be out a day ago. However, an interesting series of events occurred. So, our family has a hybrid car. We also have a non-hybrid car. But I went into my hybrid car to record because it has better audio quality and because it's not freezing cold and also because it's not inside the house where people can hear me. And the house was occupied at the time. I didn't want to, commentate very loudly within a space where people can hear me. It's just a little awkward, but I get into the car, I try recording, and about 5 minutes into the rant, my computer screen completely fritzes out. Like I'm talking, it looks like my GPU is melting. So I go back inside thinking my computer is borked and that I'm going to have to tell my patrons, hey guys, I'm not going to be able to finish the last 2 rants this month because my computer just shit the bed. But when I got inside, I booted up the computer because I had tried turning it off and turning it back on. It didn't work, so I just turned it back on, or turned it back off rather, went back inside, turned it back on, and it was fine. So then I'm like, okay, I can record the rant. It was just a little temporary bug. I go back inside the car, it immediately starts fritzing out again. It looks like my GPU is melting yet again, so I turn it off. I don't turn it off this time. I go back inside, open it up, it's still borked. So then I turn it off, turn it back on, it's no longer borked. Somehow, I don't even know how this would occur, but some way or another, I think being in the electric car specifically is fucking up my computer. If you have any insight onto what could possibly be causing this, let me know, because I genuinely do not know how being inside an electronic car would cause that, because that's the only thing I can think of. I tried recreating some of the other variables, so for example, plugging in my mic, plugging out my mic. Right now, I'm in the garage, I have my mic in, recording a rant just like I was last night. It's fine. I'm looking at my computer screen right now. Nothing's wrong with it. I was even running Blender on my computer today. I was, doing all sorts of shit that you usually do on a laptop. It was fine. Nothing happened. It was just being inside the car. But yeah, any technological experts that are better at this shit than I am, yeah, please give me your theories, give me some explanation, if you have them. Now I'm gonna stop wasting your time and actually get to the fucking rant. So, I don't necessarily remember that much about the first chapter of the story, partially because it's been a while since I've read it. The chapters come out extremely slowly, judging from how, even before he did the rant request, Chapter 2 had been out for a while, and Chapter 3 still isn't out. Many get off YouTube shorts. I know they consume your soul. You post about it in the server. But I do remember enough to get the gist of it, right? So, the main appeal of the series, if I had to regale it to you, right? So the concept is that it's basically about a genetically modified cat girl in the post-apocalypse, which sounds like the most unhinged premise to a story ever conceived, because it kind of is, and that I think is legitimately the best part of it. Because no matter what the execution is like, no matter what actually happens in the show, not the show, the book, god damn it, whatever happens in the book, Minnie can rest assured that his story is better than most isekai in existence, for the sheer fact that it has a creative bone in its body, unlike most isekai. It has an actual personality. You can tell that the person, it feels very loved. That's the thing. Whereas isekai, it is loved. I mean, Imose talks all about how isekai is loved even by its creators, even though it's generic, but it doesn't necessarily feel that way. It can feel very hollow to go through, whereas Minnie's story, The Wandering Cat, I don't know if I actually said the book title yet, but there you go, title drop, it feels like something that came from an idea that someone legitimately had for legitimate reasons, because they thought it would make for a legitimately good book. And that is something that you can't take away from it, where however cliche certain elements of it can be, for example, the science, which is about as cliche as science and, like futuristic science gets in fiction, right? It feels very by the books, and at some points even breaks the kayfabe of the story, which we'll get into. But, no matter what cliche things happen, you can't take away the original premise and the original atmosphere, which is actually my first critique, and something I told Minnie about on Discord before he ever recommended this rant request to me. Just of my own accord, I had read it and gave him my thoughts, and one of my biggest critiques was the atmosphere, specifically the way the prose conveys the atmosphere. Namely, that the prose is very basic. You can tell it's an amateur sort of story in just reading the prose, where any professionally produced novel will have infinitely first of all, better and, more smoothly flowing, more ornate and detailed prose than this. And you can get away with prose that lacks detail depending on the context. Like, for example, Imose does not have very detailed prose, but it still reads very well because the word choice is very good, and also because it's a slice of life, you don't necessarily need all the particular details. But for a post-apocalyptic story taking place so far in a laboratory in the middle of a snow blizzardy sort of setting, right? That feels like something that you would need atmosphere for. If I were writing this book, and I don't want to necessarily dictate the direction of your story too much and put too much of my personality into it, because it's your story, man, do what you want. But if I were writing it, I would try to give this element of mystery and how because it's the post-apocalypse, it has this very surreal sort of vibe with the it has a lot of very disparate plot points, right? Aliens took out Earth. There's a genetically modified cat girl. You've got a very specific texture there. And I would just hone in on that texture 100% and make it so that, it's sort of like this world that doesn't quite make sense. The laboratory could be full of machinery that the main character cannot grasp, that has like 1,000 different interweaving parts. It's too esoteric to even be comprehended at all. There's no one left on Earth to comprehend it that the main character even necessarily knows of. I think, you have something going with that. And it's not necessarily emphasized because of the fact that the prose is very standard and very, I'll just tell you what is literally happening without too much symbolism or, flowery bullshit to put onto it, right? And I think with better prose, because that was the thing, it's hard to necessarily feel grounded within the setting because of the lack of very flowery prose. I would put more words into it to allow the reader to feel more grounded within the setting and for it to just feel more satisfying to read. Another thing that sort of struck me with this chapter in particular, and granted this was a thing in the first chapter that I had actually forgotten until I reread like the last part of the chapter, because I didn't reread it in full, but I just skimmed through some parts that I was curious about to just jog my memory. And yeah, the whole alien invasion thing was revealed as of chapter 1 at the very end, and I had actually forgotten about that because it was very brisk and brief. But I actually think it might be a wrong turn to say so early that the aliens did it. There is some alluding to that there's more to the story than just the aliens, but if I were writing this, and once again, you don't have to take my advice, it's your story, man, don't put like my personality into it, but my first thought is, well, you sort of blew your load too early. You could build up to the reveal that it was aliens. And then you'll have something much more engaging, more of a mystery to be solved. And then obviously there is still a mystery component. We're looking for Taiga, who is the scientist, which we'll get more into later, and there's presumably some unanswered questions about how the world came to an end, probably to do with all the scientific weaponry that chapter 2 goes into. Which is, I guess, where I'll get into chapter 2 itself, the most recent chapter, the one I read yesterday, and the one that I have the most to say about because it's the one right on my mind. I'm sorry, Minnie. My main issue with chapter 2 is nothing made any fucking sense. Nothing even began to make sense in the chapter. Like, I was so confused at what or how or why would any of this... Why did any of this even need to happen? Why did it happen in the way it did? And how am I ever supposed to believe that any of this is real? Because it blatantly breaks suspension of disbelief at multiple parts. It is kind of nonsensical. And it it doesn't feel good to do this because you are a friend and a patron. But those are my honest thoughts on the chapter, and I want to delve into them. Right, so my first issue, and this is more of a nitpick than anything, but the scientific logs, right? The scientific... Okay, so chapter 1... the very end of it, as well as most of chapter 2, is about going through video logs left behind by Taiga. Taiga is a researcher, the person who created the main character. I honestly forgot her name. But she has a name. I just call her the genetically modified cat girl in my head. But I do remember the researcher's name. His name is Taiga. The scientific logs do not actually feel like scientific logs at all. They're more of a diary, but they don't even really feel like that. Because they're very... And I'll give him credit for this. It is conveying the information in a reasonably condensed manner. Well, asterisk, we'll get to that. But nonetheless... The diary entries feel very contrived because it's very clear that they are written to dispense information to the viewer. They are very clearly for exposition purposes. They are cut down and only convey what the reader literally needs to know at that moment. Information about the super weapons that they're developing and how Taiga feels about them. But it's, it doesn't feel like a stream of consciousness or natural at all. It is very cut down feeling. And my main question was, why are these so short? They're no more than like a paragraph long each, and Taiga keeps referring to them in her head as long. If you were actually stating all that out loud, it would literally be a minute long. These are minute-long scientific logs. They do not really feel like logs at all, because what do they even log? Nothing. It's just Taiga saying things to a camera that the reader happens to need to know at that point in time. And I felt this way at the end of the first chapter too, but I didn't actually tell Minnie this complaint of mine at the time because I wasn't actually really sure how to word it. I didn't know how, really why I was feeling the way I did, why I felt they were so unbelievable. But now that I've had an entire other chapter that is mostly just these scientific logs, I now know how to phrase it, which is that they don't feel natural. Because of the way they are so clearly designed to be exposition. Now, my fix for that would be to... and granted, it is a hard thing to fix in certain ways, but I do have a better fix for certain elements that I'll get into in a minute. But if you have to have the logs there, have the main character give a summary of what they contain. She can quote certain things, then give the gist of the rest and give the reader the impression that we're not seeing the entire thing, that the log itself would have been 20 minutes and filled with tons of miscellaneous information that the reader wouldn't need to know. But as it stands, the logs are literally just what the reader needs to know at that point in time, and it is a little too transparent in that goal to be believable. Now I'm gonna have to take a break and let my dog inside because I'm in the garage and she wanted to go out with me, but it's cold outside and I don't want her to freeze to death. So BRB. All right, we're back in business, baby. Now my next criticism of the chapter is the fact that we're even seeing these scientific logs at all, because this entire chapter, and I do mean the entire chapter, is just dry exposition. And sorry if I'm out of breath. I dashed outside for whatever reason to let my dog inside. But yeah. The entire chapter is exposition. And it's just Taiga talking to the reader, essentially. Dude, the main character, the reason why I forgot her name, more than likely, is because she doesn't really play a role in this chapter. In the first chapter, she had a personality. She came off as vaguely sassy. I couldn't really get a good read on her personality in the first chapter, but I assumed, we'd get more on that as we went on. But she came off as vaguely sassy then. But chapter 2, she doesn't really have any role in it. It's just Taiga talking to the reader. But Taiga isn't really much of a character. We know he hates the government, and god fucking damn it, we'll get to that, because that makes no sense. But nonetheless, most of the chapter is just him explaining scientific mumbo-jumbo, the relevance to the narrative of which is completely unknown. So that's another thing, right? I don't know why this chapter needed to happen. We already know that the world, the apocalypse started because of aliens. Cool. There's something else to it. Cool. We know that much. That's all we really need to know. But instead we have this whole spiel from Taiga. We already got the gist that of what was going on. We knew the government was experimenting with dark matter and bioweapons. He mentions those in passing in the previous chapter, and I had forgotten them until I skimmed it again. But the reason why I had forgotten them is because we don't need to know it. The bioweapons and dark matter stuff, as far as we know, is completely pointless. We know the aliens did it. The aliens are the important thing, right? And we know we need to look for Taiga. Taiga's important. Maybe we could see his diary or something and get to know him as a person better, because that would feel relevant to the reader. But as it stands, like all this dark matter shit, I don't know why it's relevant to the narrative. And if it is relevant to the narrative, it could be, oh, well, it was aliens, but also the government was a piece of shit and blew everyone up. Cool. But even still, it doesn't feel relevant in the moment, and most importantly, exposition is boring. You put too much exposition in a row. Even in the first chapter, Taiga talking to the reader was the most boring part of it, because it's just Taiga explaining for however long, hey, here's what happened. We are going to sit down for a predetermined amount of time and solve the mystery that you want to have still on your mind when going out into the world. But this, it wasn't so bad in chapter 1 because it wasn't the majority. It was like the final quarter maybe. It wasn't that much of the chapter being dedicated to it. But here, it's the entire chapter. It is literally the entire chapter. And I barely was able to sit through it. We didn't need to hear it. And furthermore, if we need this information, tell it in a more interesting way. I'm sure there are more interesting ways to convey this information, or even just come up with a new explanation as to why the world ended. One that doesn't involve having to learn about dark matter bombs. Now, these are just general narrative issues, but I want to get to the parts that make no fucking sense, because there are a lot of those in this chapter. So there's a scene where it's basically to exposit the power of the dark matter bomb, right? So they, through a bunch of pseudoscientific mumbo jumbo that, doesn't really make sense, probably isn't true to reality, but it doesn't matter. It's fiction, right? But nonetheless, through all that, we're able to have essentially dark matter bombs. And there's a scene where a bunch of scientists, they're setting it up to test. And they put it on this stand. Then someone knocks over the stand within the testing chamber. And a bunch of scientists are killed in this chamber, and they close it just in time before presumably the entire lab is swallowed up in it. And I'm just like, these scientists are fucking stupid. They're beyond dumb. Don't you think there would be some better level of safety precaution in a lab hired by the government to test these things? I get that the government is pretty irresponsible. They tested an atom bomb, even though they weren't sure if it would literally melt the atmosphere of the Earth and kill everyone. The true story, by the way, the United States government is fun. Like, I know they're irresponsible, but there weren't any precautions in place for a bomb that if you drop it, it goes off. Wouldn't there be a machine claw to put it down and then test it? Do they really need to be in the room with it? Come on. There are so many ways to do this that don't involve knocking it over and having a bunch of scientists die. Why did that need to be a thing? I don't get it. Okay. So let's see. Blah, blah. All right, here we go. So there's a moment in Taiga's video logs where, there's this censored bit, and then he goes on to say, oh, well, the government censored my last log, because it was sensitive information. It was like information on the bioweapons that automatically cause necrosis or whatever. And you lost me. You completely fucking lost me. That there are so many levels in which that does not make any sense that my brain was exploding with questions. All right, so the issue is, so Taiga doesn't like the government. It's very clear, listening to these things, that he doesn't like the government. He's very, very blunt about the fact that the government is testing on children and innocent people. Like, they couldn't even get death row inmates to test these bioweapons on. He literally refers to them as a dictatorship and said, oh yeah, they suppress the media, they're gonna stop people from figuring out about these things. Good old dictatorship, right? You're sending that to the fucking dictatorship! Why? Why would you say that? And, I mean, it's implied at a certain point that he stops sending them to the government. At least I'm pretty sure. I vaguely remember that in Chapter 1 he was so blatant about it that there was never any way that he could send it to them. So I don't exactly remember, once again. But I have an inkling in my mind that there must be some point in the timeline in which he stops sending these to the government. But just like, why? Why not specify very clearly? More importantly, like, this is completely unnecessary. This plot point doesn't need to be there. They can just be his own diary. Because that's what I thought they were before we got to this point. Like, it was a mix of a scientific log and a diary. And it was just for him and perhaps some co-workers. It didn't necessarily need to be sent directly to the top, but he sends it to the fucking government, where he tells them to their face that they're a dictatorship. Isn't he afraid of getting blackbagged? Isn't he afraid of getting edited from photos and having his he does get his, not his existence covered up, but he does end up having his death faked. But isn't he afraid of disappearing? But come on. And furthermore, I found it really strange that he refers to the government as the government. He has to be sending these to a person. You don't send video logs of your scientific experiments to thegovernment@gmail.com. You send it to someone very specific who then forwards it to other people in the multitude of systems that make up the government. But it's not the president seeing these things more than likely. I mean, maybe it is. Maybe that is the case. But more than likely, it's just some other brand. It's some guy who's seeing them at the top that was appointed by someone who was appointed by someone who was appointed by the president of the United States, or whatever country this is. I'm just assuming the United States. Maybe they specified that at some point. But it's like, to call it so blanketly the government, I'm sending these to the government. No, you're sending them to someone specific, aren't you? But I don't think that much was thought through, per se, like the individual people making up the systems, because I get it. It's hard to make a convincing chain of command in the government when that's really outside the purview of most people, which is why I'm lucky to have only written stuff that are like rom-coms and, like dramas that take place within reality, but within my place in reality as just an ordinary citizen. So I don't necessarily have to understand all of these systems. But for a story like this, him referring to it as the government isn't necessarily like, it's not necessarily a plot hole. It's not going to completely ruin the story. If it was just that by its lonesome, I probably wouldn't even mention it. But it's that combined with the other multitude of elements that made me think that this story should be thought through a lot more before you put things that are blatantly nonsensical. So yeah, after that's about the end of my complaints about this chapter and my thoughts on it. So, conclusion. I think you have something good going on with the vibes. Obviously you're an amateur writer, and that's fine. Like, I'm not expecting something of the quality of published material. And, I apologize if I come off as overly caustic at some points within this rant review thing. I am just trying to give my authentic impressions of the story, and, hopefully I'm not an asshole about it or anything like that. But yeah, like, I do legitimately think it has potential, but I also think that there are a lot of things that need to be ironed out. Less exposition, less plot holes, more atmosphere, more doing what I think the story has going for it. And like, I do think that these two chapters together, if rewritten significantly, retooled in a million different ways, could make a very convincing block of content to adapt within a 24-minute episode of anime or something like that. And it would be like a really good hook for the hypothetical anime version of this. I don't know why I'm talking about the hypothetical anime version. It'd just straight up be a good hook for a novel, right? But I don't think it's quite there. That's about it. This rant was 27 minutes, goddamn. See ya.